Life and death in Bali, the firing squad for 2 Australians and life in jail for 2 more for heroin trafficking. The Prime Minister flags a review of AWB's wheat monopoly as a company executive comes under further fire at the coal inquiry. Election outcry sparks fears of a new descent into violence in Haiti. And the Australian cartoonist embroiled in the row over caricatures of Muhammad. Good evening, Anton Enos with SBS World News Australia. The 2 ringleaders of the Bali 9 are to face a firing squad after the Denpasar District Court today sentenced Andrew Chan and Muran Sukumaran to death. It's the first time the Bali court has issued the ultimate penalty for drug offences. As they were sentenced, 2 more of the so-called drug mules were given life in jail for their part in the heroin smuggling operation.
It was a characteristically chaotic arrival for Andrew Chan and Muran Sukumaran as they were brought to the Denpasar District Court to hear their fate. The 2 Bali 9 ringleaders had a tense wait in the holding cells, knowing that once they entered the court, the death penalty was highly likely. Also brought for sentencing 2 of the so-called mules, Michael Chugai and Martin Stevens, both anticipating a life behind bars. Friends and family on hand to offer what little solace they could. Andrew Chan was taken from the holding cell and entered the court with an air of inevitability. He sat impassively as the judge read out his lengthy verdict, judgment coming shortly after an hour, confirming the 22-year-old's worst fears.
Demikian isi putusan bagi terdakwa.
With the death penalty handed down, a clearly distressed Muran Sukumaran knew he almost certainly faced the same fate. Chan had pleaded his innocence. Sukumaran, on the other hand, had kept his silence throughout the trial. The judges cited the 24-year-old's lack of remorse as they delivered another damning verdict. It's the first time the Denpasar District Court has handed down the ultimate penalty for drug offences, death by firing squad. Under Indonesian law, the execution can be carried out within 7 days, so appeals are expected to be lodged almost immediately. If they fail, the Australian government says it will lobby Indonesia for clemency, but the Prime Minister says their punishment should be a warning to others.
Can I just say to every young Australian, please take notice of this. I even beg them not to take the terrible risks that these young people have done.
For those of the Bali 9 given jail sentences, the government has held out the prospect of a prisoner exchange. That may offer some hope to drug mules Michael Chugai and Martin Stevens, who today were given life. Jane Braslin, World News Australia.
Shortly after the verdicts were handed down, Foreign Minister Alexander Downer told Parliament that officials were working on a prisoner exchange program with Indonesia.
We have been discussing with the Indonesian authorities a prisoner exchange agreement, and these discussions are in an early stage. Let me remind the House that similar negotiations with Thailand took 5 years. I hope with Indonesia the negotiations will take nothing like 5 years, but these negotiations could take time, and we should, of course, continue as a government to do our best to make sure we can negotiate a satisfactory agreement. What implications such an agreement would have for people currently in jail in Indonesia, we don't know yet because those negotiations are still underway.
The Prime Minister is to meet the head of AWB tomorrow to discuss changes that could see the company relinquish its monopoly over wheat exports. As the Oil for Food inquiry continues, Labor has again tried to scrutinise the government over its alleged role in the scandal.
Opposition parties have spent much of the day questioning the head of the Wheat Export Authority, which monitors AWB's wheat sales, often with fiery exchanges.
You do not have to respond to that sort of intimidation. It's not a question not wanting to see it. That's a ridiculous statement.
In 2004, the authority investigated allegations that AWB was paying bribes to Iraq. The The authority's chairman has told a Senate Estimates Committee AWB assured him it wasn't paying any kickbacks.
We looked them in the eye, they came back, looked us in the eye and said, look, we've done no wrong, here's our code of conduct, here's our agency facilitation thing, we looked at that. What more do you do? I mean, we trusted them, and you have to ask a question, were we unwise to do so?
Labor's continuing to ask about a 2003 US Defence Audit report which links AWB to inflated wheat contracts. And with Iraq suspending imports of Australian wheat, the opposition's accused the Trade Minister of damaging the wheat industry.
From the outset, the government has been very diligent in ensuring that Australian wheat growers of interest have been looked after every inch of the way.
There may be a shake-up of wheat exporting arrangements. The Prime Minister will meet the chairman of AWB tomorrow. There's speculation other companies may be given approval to sell wheat overseas.
The Australian wheat growers' best friends in this parliament are the Liberal and National parties, Mr Speaker.
With friends like them, do they need enemies?
The wheat industry is confident new markets will be found outside of Iraq, but it wants growers to retain ownership and control of wheat exports.
Well, it's a great cause of concern for us that the single desk itself has been drawn into the coal inquiry.
And it appears that the kickback scandal may also be damaging the government. The latest news poll shows Labor's support has increased with the focus on AWB. Richard Davis, World News, Australia.
An AWB executive has told the Coal Inquiry that the United Nations approved Australian wheat contracts that included sham trucking fees used to funnel kickbacks to the former Iraqi regime. But Charles Stott could not produce documents to back his claims, and he's been accused of fabricating a conspiracy theory.
Back in the witness stand at the Coal Inquiry, AWB executive Charles Stott was questioned about trucking fees added to wheat contracts with Iraq under the UN's Oil for Food program. He said he always believed the Iraqis had UN approval for the escalation of inland transport costs allegedly used to funnel kickbacks. Mr Stott was shown an AWB copy of an Iraqi contract for the supply of Australian wheat that did not specify any trucking fees. But he claimed he'd seen a signed and sealed faxed version of the same contract that did detail the fees, and hence he believed the UN was informed. Mr Stott was grilled about why he'd never raised such evidence before and whether it was fabricated. He suggested he'd been deceived by people within AWB. Is the deception occurring in that witness box now, Mr Stott? Asked Senior Counsel John Aegis. I think this has been quite a cleverly thought through deception that has involved people in the company, Mr Stott told the inquiry. He also claimed he'd told other AWB managers about the mysterious Iraqi contract he'd seen. At that point, the Commissioner Terence Cole warned Mr Stott that he should think carefully about who he told about the documents and whether he wished to maintain or change his testimony. Mr Stott stuck to his story but could not produce any documents to back it, and was accused of fabricating a conspiracy theory to conceal his knowledge of sanctions-busting kickbacks to the former Iraqi regime. The inquiry continues. Vesna Nazor, World News Australia.
The House of Representatives has begun debating the approval process for the abortion pill RU486 following the Senate's decision to remove a ministerial veto. The controversy surrounding the debate has escalated after Liberal MP Dana Vale suggested that abortion rates would turn Australia into a Muslim nation. Colleagues are distancing themselves, and opposition parties and some Muslim leaders say she should be reprimanded.
They were trying to promote a compromise, shifting the RU486 veto power not to the Therapeutic Goods Administration but to Parliament. But backbencher Dana Vale shifted the debate, saying an imam from Sydney's Lakemba Mosque was predicting Australia would be mostly Muslim in 50 years.
I didn't believe him at the time, but when you actually look at the birth rates and you look at the fact that we are aborting ourselves almost out of existence, you multiply that by 50 years, that's 5 million potential Australians we won't have here.
I think Dana's on her own on that one.
It certainly seemed that way.
I think Dana Vale's comments were dopey. I think they reeked of prejudice and ignorance.
I think they're offensive. She should apologise.
In Lakemba, the Muslim Women's Association agrees. Maha Abdo says attitudes have improved since she was young.
We are moving forward and we're progressing, and that's the way I'd like to see that debate is being taken on at that level, which is inclusive of the whole of the Australian community.
The former minister hasn't apologised but is defending herself.
I wish to make a personal explanation.
Arguing she didn't say Muslim women were having too many children.
I have never used those words, Mr. Speaker, and I never would use those words.
The Democrats say it's dangerous Islamophobia and the Prime Minister should step in.
What are his values? Does he support that kind of comment? And if he doesn't, he should say so.
Mr Howard's comments were indirect and private, telling coalition MPs in their party room to keep debate sensible and dignified. Publicly, it was the Immigration Minister correcting the record.
In the next 50 years, Australia will remain what it is today, a predominantly English-speaking, very multicultural and diverse country.
Late today, the lower house debate began.
I thought human life was a little bit more than the clinical cold consideration of a faceless group of bureaucrats.
RU 486 is a dangerous drug that must not be permitted into the market.
Just as we don't want politicians in our bedrooms, we also certainly don't want them in our doctors' consulting rooms with us either.
Abortion should be safe, legal and rare.
They'll vote on Thursday. Karen Middleton, World News Australia.
The Indigenous community of Broome in the Kimberley region of Western Australia has won a 10-year battle to prove its right to native title over the land. The Yaru people say the decision provides certainty for future generations and will protect the popular tourist destination from overdevelopment. Their claim covers 6,000 square kilometres. Freehold land is exempt from native title claims and legal argument continues over which other areas should be excluded. An inquiry has been told that Australia's Defence Force ignored a recommendation to install shoulder harnesses in its ageing fleet of Sea King naval helicopters prior to last year's fatal crash on the Indonesian island of Nias. 9 military personnel were killed. The helicopter was said to have been fitted only with lap restraints, despite the findings of an investigation into a crash in 1995 which called for harnesses. An aviation medical specialist also told the inquiry that more lives might have been saved if a crash-proof fuel system had been installed in the helicopter. Ousted Iraqi President Saddam Hussein has again clashed with the judge in charge of his trial for crimes against humanity. Saddam announced that he'd gone on a hunger strike in protest at the judge's tough stance.
Saddam Hussein appeared in court, once again clad in his trademark black business suit. Yesterday he'd appeared dishevelled and wearing his slippers. His half-brother Ibrahim Barzan wearing long underwear for a second day, signalling his rejection of the court. Saddam Hussein resumed the defiance he'd displayed in yesterday's session, telling the judge to hit his own head with the gavel and shouting his support for Iraqi insurgents. Yesterday also featured heated exchanges, Saddam shouting "down with Bush" as his brother staged a sit-down strike, turning his back on the judge. And for the first time, prosecutors put 2 former members of Saddam's regime on the stand. They were shown documents allegedly signed by the Iraqi leader in 1984, agreeing to the execution of Iraqis in the town of Dujail. But they refused to give evidence against him. Meanwhile, British military police have arrested a man in connection with a video which shows British soldiers beating civilians in Iraq 2 years ago. The arrest comes with the release of new footage, reportedly filmed just moments before the alleged abuse took place, which appears to show British troops under fire. It's believed that this is the man who has been detained, Corporal Martin Webster, who filmed the clashes in question and spoke about his experiences in a 2004 interview.
The last month of our tour was absolute hell there. During the daytime you would have the riots and then at night time you'd have the firefights.
I'm not excusing their actions, but it's hardly surprising when they're shot at, bombed, stoned on a daily basis, comrades injured and that tour 1 was killed. It's hardly surprising that occasionally they'll be tempted to retaliate.
It's not clear whether Corporal Webster is being held as a witness or a suspect. Cassandra Hill, World News Australia.
Hundreds of thousands of flag-waving Lebanese have gathered in central Beirut to mark the first anniversary of the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri. His killing provoked a political upheaval that ended Syria's 3-decade-long military presence in Lebanon and led to the election of an anti-Syrian government. 20 other people also died in the bomb attack that killed Hariri. Recapping our top stories now, Australia is to ask Indonesia for clemency for the ringleaders of the Bali 9 who've been sentenced to death. The AWB's control of wheat sales is expected to come under scrutiny during crisis talks tomorrow. And later in the programme, angry protests in Haiti over the presidential election result. Iran has tonight confirmed that it has resumed the enrichment of uranium. It comes just over a week after the UN's nuclear watchdog reported Iran to the Security Council over fears that Tehran was developing a covert nuclear weapons program. UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan has urged US President George W. Bush not to take any steps that could escalate the crisis. Despite the international furor, Iran says it's unacceptable for it to halt its enrichment research. The capital of Haiti has been paralysed by protests for a fifth day over the inconclusive results of last week's presidential election. At least one person was killed as angry demonstrators stormed a luxury hotel, demanding that the leading candidate, René Préval, be declared president.
After days of waiting, something had to give. Protesters forced their way into a Port-au-Prince hotel where election results are being announced, certain their candidate, René Préval, has won. With 90% of the votes counted, the Provisional Electoral Council says Mr. Préval is just short of the 50% needed for outright victory. His nearest challenger has less than 12%. And these people believe officials have manipulated the results to force a runoff vote. As the tension increased, UN troops took up positions to evacuate high-ranking officials staying at the hotel. But one guest refused to leave. Visiting South African Bishop Desmond Tutu called for calm, to little avail. As the demonstration spread, Mr. Préval arrived in the capital for the first time since the election a week ago from his rural home in the north. He said he was going to consult UN officials and other diplomats to find out what had gone wrong with the election process and to find a way out of the crisis. But the protests continued, most intense in the poorer areas where Mr. Préval is viewed as a hero. The violence has claimed at least one victim. A United Nations spokesman denying witness reports that UN soldiers had fired the fatal shots. The renewed violence has raised fears the impoverished country will once again descend into chaos. Last week's elections were aimed at replacing an interim government installed after the former president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, was ousted in a bloody rebellion 2 years ago. Amrita Chima, World News Australia.
Leading Australian cartoonist Michael Leunig says he's shocked to find that one of his controversial cartoons has been used on an Iranian newspaper website. Leunig insists that he's the victim of an elaborate hoax.
Michael Leunig, the creator of Mr. Curly, can also court political controversy. This 2002 reflection on Israel's military policy, using Auschwitz as a metaphor, was not published by The Age newspaper. Now it's turned up on an Iranian newspaper website calling for global competition, retaliating for the Muhammad cartoons.
The competition seeks to test the West's commitment to freedom of expression by using images of the Jewish Holocaust. Leunig is appalled that he's been caught in the middle of this hoax.
A shock, it was a disturbance, and I knew there was trouble. And I knew it wasn't my doing to put it there.
The Age says it will be taking legal action.
We've alerted our solicitors to make inquiries both in terms of how the information flowed to the site.
Leunig says the original cartoon, after being published on the internet, prompted threatening hate mail and attacks from other media.
It's not such an offensive cartoon in essence. I stand by, there's an intelligent message in that cartoon. It's an anti-war cartoon.
Michael Leunig says there are boundaries to artistic expression and he wouldn't portray an image of Muhammad. He says these are difficult times for cartoonists, but he holds to the tradition of being like a court jester.
You must say the unsayable. You must dare to speak out.
The anti-war artist says he'd rather be painting ducks. Gabby Hills, World News Australia.
A draft US congressional report into the response to the Hurricane Katrina disaster has branded it a national failure. The report blames shortcomings at all levels of government for the suffering and loss of life.
The US Congress has issued its draft report into the handling of Hurricane Katrina, and the findings are damning. The Republican-led investigation called it a national failure, an abdication of the most solemn obligations to provide for the common welfare. And the committee didn't stop there. If this is what happens when we have advance warning, we shudder to imagine the consequences when we do not, it said. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, which is part of the Homeland Security Department, is in the firing line. The report says that FEMA knew more than 2 days in advance that 75% of New Orleans was probably going to be flooded. Singled out the department secretary Michael Chertoff, who executed his responsibilities late, ineffectively or not at all, it said. Michael Chertoff says he'll accept responsibility.
I want to be clear. As the Secretary of Homeland Security, I am accountable and accept responsibility for the performance of the entire department, good and bad. I also have the responsibility to fix what went wrong.
Part of that fix is a major overhaul of FEMA. But there's more bad news. Millions of dollars in Katrina aid has been lost to fraud, handed over to people who gave false identities and addresses. And this week, 12,000 families who lost their homes in the hurricane are being evicted from their emergency hotel accommodation. FEMA has stopped footing the bill for the accommodation.
I hate to leave here, but I have to go.
But to where? 5 months on, many say they have nowhere to go. Jenny Lavelle, World News Australia.
To the finance figures now. The Australian share market has continued its recent volatility, erasing most of yesterday's losses. BHP Billiton led the miners higher ahead of what's expected to be Australia's biggest half-year profit. Strong beer sales boosted Foster's latest underlying earnings, but the market is fretting that a grape glut is hurting wine sales. Bionic earmaker Cochlear, however, exceeded profit forecasts with its latest product, the stock up 5%. On the Asian markets, Tokyo and Hong Kong enjoyed strong gains thanks to bargain hunting. A generous national budget expected this Friday boosted Singapore's share market. Markets in Europe are mixed in a slow start to the trading day. Wall Street slumped on fresh interest rate jitters and suggestions that Google may be vastly overvalued. The Australian dollar remains little changed against our major trading partners. And on the commodity markets, gold and oil are lower. A record-breaking century by Adam Gilchrist has powered Australia to victory in the one-day cricket series decider against Sri Lanka at the Gabba in Brisbane tonight. Simon Katich also chipped in a century to help it take Australia to 1 for 267. That's in reply to Sri Lanka's 9 for 266. Gilchrist's 100 off just 67 balls was the fastest ever limited over century by an Australian batsman.
Disappointed with that. Not a bad ground, the Gabba. It's about second on. The pitch is very good.
And finally tonight, a rare and rarely seen Chinese panda has managed to attract the attention of an entire village after raiding the local cabbage patch. Eschewing its normal diet of bamboo leaves, the panda led 80 villagers a merry dance through the cabbages and later an orchard filled with fruit trees. After 5 fruitless hours of pursuit, the villagers called in experts who used tranquilizers to sedate the panda and take it to a breeding centre. However, they say it'll be released back into the wild in a few days. Let's check the weather now. Cloud over the northern tropics. Near a weak monsoon may trigger storms. Unsettled too along the New South Wales-Queensland border and dry elsewhere. In the major centres, drizzle clearing in Sydney, sunny for Melbourne and Perth, and becoming fine in Adelaide. Looking further afield, a clear change for Christchurch. More rain, though, in Nandi. In Southeast Asia, another foggy start for Hong Kong, sunny over Manila, stormy for Singapore and also for Port Moresby.